Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we travel together to a distant place and a distant time. We journey to the frozen waters north of Alaska, to the year 1913, and to a wooden ship called Karluk that drifted slowly through the Arctic ice with 25 souls aboard. This is a story of patience. It is a story of lantern light in long polar nights, of quiet cooperation among strangers, and of the steady resilience that carried ordinary people through extraordinary circumstances. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this journey holds moments of hardship. Some who set out on this expedition did not return home. We will speak of them with dignity and care. There will be no graphic details, no alarming sounds, no sudden changes in our pace. This telling is meant for rest, for reflection, and for the gentle drift toward sleep. If you are settling in for the night, you are most welcome here. If you are traveling, studying, or simply seeking a quiet hour, you belong here too. Let the day's weight ease from your shoulders. Let your breathing slow. We will move through this story at the pace of snowfall, at the rhythm of ice shifting beneath a frozen sea. Take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders soften. We begin gently. The map unfolds before us. The year is 1913. Let us step into the cold together. On the morning of June 17, 1913, a brigantine named Karluk slipped away from the harbor at Esquimalt, British Columbia. The Canadian flags hanging from her mast barely stirred in the mild summer air. Onlookers watched from the dock as the vessel moved toward open water, her wooden hull sitting low with the weight of supplies, scientific equipment, and provisions enough for 2 years in the Arctic. This was the flagship of the Canadian Arctic Expedition, an ambitious government-sponsored venture meant to explore the unmapped coastlines and islands of Canada's far north. The expedition's leader was a man named Vilhjalmur Stefansson, a Canadian-born explorer of Icelandic descent who had already spent years living among Inuit communities in the Arctic. Stefansson was 33 years old, confident, and deeply curious about the lands that lay beyond the charted edges of known maps. He believed there might be undiscovered islands in the Beaufort Sea. He wanted to study the ice, the currents, and the wildlife of the polar regions, and he had convinced the Canadian government to fund an expedition that would combine scientific research with geographic exploration. The Karluk herself was not a young ship. She had been built in 1884 as a fishing vessel, designed for the cod fisheries off the coast of Newfoundland. Her hull was reinforced with thick oak planking, which made her reasonably sturdy, but she was never intended for the crushing pressures of heavy Arctic ice. Stefansson had purchased her because she was available, affordable, and could be readied in time. It was a compromise that would later prove significant. At the helm stood Captain Robert Abram Bartlett, a 48-year-old Newfoundlander with decades of polar experience. Bartlett had sailed north many times before. He had accompanied Robert Peary on expeditions toward the North Pole and knew the Arctic's dangers as intimately as anyone alive. He was a quiet, steady man, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, and deeply practical. From the beginning, Bartlett had reservations about the Karluk. He knew her limitations. He understood that the ship was not built for the kind of ice she would encounter in the Beaufort Sea. But he was a captain, and captains do not abandon their vessels or their crews. When the expedition set sail, Bartlett stood at his post with calm resolve. Aboard the Karluk that June morning were 25 people. Among them were scientists and researchers, a geologist, a meteorologist, an anthropologist, a magnetician, and a topographer. There were sailors and deckhands, a cook, and a ship's doctor. And there were 4 members of 2 Inuit families, people whose knowledge of Arctic survival would prove essential in the months ahead. Karluk was an experienced hunter from northern Alaska. His wife, Karluk, was skilled in sewing the caribou skin clothing that could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite. Their 2 young daughters, Helen and Mugby, were just 3 years old and 8 years old, respectively. They played on deck during the long summer days, unaware of the journey that awaited. There was also Claude Katiktovik, a young Inuit man of about 19 years, hired as a hunter and guide. His knowledge of ice, of seal hunting, and of navigating frozen landscapes would become invaluable beyond measure. The crew brought dogs, sled dogs from Alaska, strong and thick-coated, trained to pull heavy loads across snow and ice. They brought pemmican and hardtack, canned goods and flour, tea and tobacco. They brought rifles and ammunition, tents and sleeping bags, stoves and fuel. Everything was packed and stowed with the care of people who knew they would be far from any resupply. As the Karluk sailed northward through the summer weeks, the crew fell into comfortable routines. Scientists set up their instruments and organized their notebooks. Sailors checked lines and rigging. The cook prepared meals in the small galley, the scent of fresh bread drifting through the lower decks. The weather was mild. The sea was calm. The midnight sun hung low on the horizon, casting long golden light across the water even in the small hours of the night. By late July, the Karluk had passed through the Bering Strait and entered the Chukchi Sea. The water grew colder. The first pieces of drift ice appeared, white fragments floating past the hull like scattered pieces of a broken puzzle. At first, these ice floes seemed manageable. The ship pushed through them without difficulty. But as the days passed, the ice grew thicker and more persistent. The open channels between floes became narrower. The Karluk's progress slowed. On August 5, 1913, the expedition reached Point Barrow, the northernmost tip of Alaska. It was here that Stephenson had planned to rendezvous with other vessels and supplies. But the ice conditions were worse than expected. The northern waters were choked with pack ice, and the window for safe passage was closing. Stephenson made a decision. Rather than wait at Point Barrow, he ordered the Karluk to push forward, hopping to find a route through the ice to their intended base at Wrangel Island, far to the east. Captain Bartlett complied, though he noted the risks in his log. The ship sailed northeast, threading her way through leads of open water, searching for a path that grew more elusive with each passing hour. By August 13th, the Karluk was approximately 100 miles north of Point Barrow. The ice had closed in around her. The engines fell silent, not from failure but from futility. There was no longer anywhere to sail. The ship was beset. That evening, lantern light glowed softly from the portholes of the Karluk as she sat motionless in the frozen sea. The crew gathered in the mess for supper, their voices quiet, their thoughts turning toward the long wait ahead. No one yet understood how long that wait would become. No one knew that the Karluk would never sail again under her own power. But in the amber warmth of the galley, with the scent of coffee and stew in the air, the 25 souls aboard found a fragile comfort in one another's company. The expedition had changed. It was no longer a journey of exploration. It was now a lesson in patience, in endurance, and in the quiet strength required to survive when the world turns white and still. The lantern light holds steady. Rest your eyes if you wish. The story continues, and we drift with them into the ice. The morning of August 14, 1913, dawned gray and still. Aboard the Karluk, the crew woke to an unfamiliar silence, the engines cold, the familiar vibration of movement absent. Through the frost-edged portholes, they could see only white. The ice stretched in every direction, an unbroken plain that met the pale sky at a horizon nearly impossible to distinguish. Captain Bartlett stood on deck in the early hours, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. He studied the ice with practiced eyes, noting the way the floes pressed against the Karluk's hull, the subtle creaking sounds that rose and fell like slow breathing. He had seen ice like this before. He knew what it meant. The ship was not merely stopped. She was held. The pack ice had frozen solid around her during the night, and now the Karluk was embedded in the Arctic like a fossil in stone. For the crew below, the first hours of immobility passed in quiet adjustment. The scientists continued organizing their equipment. The sailors checked the rigging and secured loose items. The cook, a practical man named Robert Templeman, prepared breakfast as though this were any ordinary morning. But the silence was different now. Without the engine's steady hum, every sound became amplified: the creak of timber, the whisper of wind across ice, the distant groaning of floes pressing together somewhere beyond sight. Stephenson paced the deck that afternoon, studying maps and calculating positions. He had planned for delays, but not for this. The expedition's scientific work depended on reaching their base at Wrangel Island, where supplies and additional personnel waited. But Wrangel Island lay more than 300 miles to the east, across ice that showed no sign of opening. On August 19th, Stephenson made an announcement that would shape everything that followed. He informed the crew that he intended to take a small party ashore to hunt caribou. Fresh meat would be valuable, he explained. The hunting grounds near the Alaskan coast were only a few miles away, and he expected to return within 10 days. Captain Bartlett listened without comment. He noted the decision in his log with his usual careful hand, but privately he had doubts. The ice was unpredictable. The ship could drift at any moment, and once Stephenson left, there would be no way to communicate, no way to coordinate, no way to reunite if circumstances changed. On September 20th, Stephenson departed with a party of 5 men, 2 sleds, and several dogs. They walked across the ice toward the distant shore, their figures growing smaller until they disappeared into the white horizon. They would never return to the Karluk. Within days of Stephenson's departure, the ice began to move. The frozen sea was not static. It was carried by powerful ocean currents, pushed by winds, shifted by forces far beneath the surface. The pack ice in which the Karluk was trapped was part of the Beaufort Gyre, a vast circular current that rotated slowly clockwise through the Arctic Ocean. The ship began to drift, slowly at first, so slowly that the movement was barely perceptible. But steadily, unmistakably, the Karluk was being carried northwest, away from Alaska, away from any hope of reaching Stephenson's hunting party. By early October, the Karluk had drifted more than 50 miles from her original position. The Alaskan coast was no longer visible, even on the clearest days. The ship was alone in a wilderness of ice, surrounded by frozen ridges and flat expanses that looked the same in every direction. For the crew, this realization settled in gradually. There were no dramatic announcements, no moments of panic. The men simply understood over the course of quiet evenings and long watches that their situation had fundamentally changed. They were no longer waiting for a passage to open. They were passengers now, carried by the ice to destinations unknown. Captain Bartlett assumed full command with the steady calm that defined his character. He gathered the crew in the mess one evening and spoke plainly. The ship was drifting. There was no way to control their movement. Their task now was to conserve supplies, maintain routines, and prepare for whatever lay ahead. No one spoke of rescue because rescue was impossible. No one could know where they were. No ship could reach them through the ice. The Karluk carried no radio. Wireless telegraphy was still a relatively new technology, and this expedition had not been equipped with it. The only communication possible was written: journals, letters, logs. The crew wrote often in those early weeks of drift, recording observations of ice and weather, confiding thoughts and worries to pages that might never be read. In the mess, by lantern light, the men gathered each evening after supper. Some played cards. Some read from the small library of books aboard. Some simply sat in silence, watching the yellow glow of the lamp and listening to the distant sounds of ice. The Inuit families adapted with particular grace. Karluk and Karluk had lived their entire lives in Arctic conditions. They understood the rhythms of ice and cold in ways that the European and American crew members were only beginning to learn. They moved through the ship with quiet confidence, helping where they could, teaching without condescension. Little Helen and Mugby, the two young daughters, seemed almost untroubled by the circumstances. They played games in the hold, bundled in furs, their laughter echoing through the wooden corridors. For them, the Karluk was simply home. A strange home, perhaps, but home nonetheless. The days grew shorter. By late October, the sun barely rose above the horizon before sinking again. By November, true darkness arrived, the polar night when the sun would not rise at all for weeks on end. The crew adjusted their routines. Lanterns burned constantly in the common areas. Watches were kept around the clock, men taking turns to monitor the ice pressure against the hull. The ship groaned and creaked as the frozen sea squeezed and released in an endless, restless rhythm. Through it all, the Karluk drifted, slowly, steadily, without pause. The current carried her northwest, then west, then southwest, tracing an invisible path across the frozen Arctic. By December, the ship had traveled more than 200 miles from where she had first become trapped. The crew marked the days on calendars, celebrated Christmas with what cheer they could muster, and waited. There was nothing else to do. Let the stillness settle around you now. The ship drifts slowly through the dark. There is no hurry and no need for waking. Rest here with them in the quiet of the ice. To understand what happened to the Karluk, we must first understand the ice itself. The Arctic Ocean is not a frozen stillness. It is a moving, breathing, ever-shifting landscape of ice that flows with the currents beneath it. In the region where the Karluk drifted, the dominant force was the Beaufort Gyre, a massive circular current that rotates clockwise, carrying everything caught within it in a slow, vast spiral. When the Karluk became trapped in August of 1913, she entered this gyre. From that moment forward, she was no longer a ship in any meaningful sense. She was a passenger, embedded in the ice, moving wherever the current chose to take her. The drift was imperceptible at first. In the early days, the crew had no way to measure their movement. The ice looked the same in every direction, flat white expanses broken by occasional pressure ridges, low hills of jumbled ice pushed up where floes collided. Without landmarks, without reference points, the sense of motion was almost impossible to detect. But Captain Bartlett was a navigator of exceptional skill. He took readings of their position whenever the sky was clear enough to see the stars, and later, when the polar night descended, whenever the stars wheeled overhead in the unending darkness. He recorded their latitude and longitude in his log with careful precision. The numbers told the story. By September, the Karluk had drifted 20 miles from her original position. By October, she had moved 50 miles. By November, the total had grown to more than 100 miles. The movement was not smooth. The ice field shifted in fits and starts, sometimes covering several miles in a single day, sometimes holding nearly still for a week. The crew could occasionally feel the motion, a subtle swaying, a distant grinding, but mostly the drift was silent, invisible, relentless. Life aboard the ship took on a strange rhythm. With no destination to reach and no schedule to keep, time became elastic. The days blurred together, marked only by meals, by watch changes, by the slow dimming and brightening of the polar twilight. Captain Bartlett established routines that gave structure to the shapeless hours. Each man had duties: maintaining the ship, tending the dogs, keeping watch, helping in the galley. The work was not urgent. There was no port to reach, no cargo to deliver. But Bartlett understood that purposeless time could be more dangerous than any physical threat. Idle men grew anxious. Idle minds wandered toward dark thoughts. By assigning tasks and maintaining discipline, Bartlett kept the crew occupied and focused. The galley became the heart of the ship. It was the warmest space aboard, heated by the iron stove where the cook prepared meals. The crew gathered there for breakfast and supper, their breath fogging in the air, their hands wrapped around tin cups of tea. The food was simple but adequate in those early months. Canned goods, dried beans, rice, hardtack biscuits, and the occasional fresh seal meat brought in by the hunters. The cook, Robert Templeman, performed small miracles with limited ingredients, producing soups and stews that warmed the body and lifted the spirits. Rationing had not yet become severe. The expedition had been provisioned for 2 years, and while there were concerns about how long the supplies would last, the immediate situation was manageable. Bartlett kept careful inventories, tracking every can and every barrel, calculating consumption against unknown future needs. The sleeping quarters were less comfortable than the galley. The crew's bunks were arranged in the lower decks, small wooden berths lined with wool blankets and caribou skins. The cold seeped through the hull despite the insulation, and men slept in layers of clothing, their breath freezing on the blankets by morning. Above deck, The world was a wilderness of white and gray. The ice stretched to every horizon, broken only by the pressure ridges, walls of jumbled ice that rose and fell as floes collided and separated. These ridges could be beautiful in a harsh way, sculpted by wind and cold into fantastic shapes that caught the faint light of the polar twilight. But they were also dangerous. When pressure ridges formed too close to the ship, they threatened to crush the hull. The crew listened constantly for the sounds of ice pressure, the deep groaning, the sharp cracks, the grinding rumble that meant floes were colliding nearby. In November, a particularly violent pressure event sent tremors through the Karluk. The crew rushed on deck to find a ridge forming less than 100 yards from the ship, blocks of ice as large as houses being pushed upward by unimaginable force. They watched in silence as the ridge grew, then stabilized, then settled into stillness. The Karluk survived that night, but the experience reminded everyone aboard of how fragile their situation truly was. Through it all, the drift continued. By late December, the Karluk had traveled more than 300 miles from Point Barrow. She had moved northwest into the Chukchi Sea, carried by the gyre toward the distant coasts of Siberia. The crew celebrated Christmas with what festivity they could manage. The cook prepared a special meal: canned plum pudding, roasted seal, extra rations of tea. Someone produced a harmonica, and the men sang carols in the amber light of the mess, their voices rising and falling in the darkness outside. Captain Bartlett gave a quiet speech. He thanked the crew for their patience and their work. He acknowledged the uncertainty ahead, and he expressed his confidence that they would endure whatever came. No one spoke of rescue. No one spoke of how the journey might end. They simply sang and ate and sat together in the warmth of the galley while the ice carried them onward through the polar night. The new year arrived without fanfare. January 1914 began cold and dark, the sun still hidden below the horizon, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. The Karluk drifted on. The ice carries them gently now, and it may carry you as well. Let yourself drift with them into the quiet, into the dark, into rest. In the modern world, we are surrounded by connection. Messages travel in moments. Voices span oceans. News arrives before we have time to wonder about it. But in 1913, aboard a ship frozen in the Arctic ice, none of this existed. The Karluk carried no radio. Wireless telegraphy, though invented, was not yet standard equipment on expeditions of this kind. There were no satellites, no signal flares that anyone would see, no passing ships that might relay a message. The crew of the Karluk was utterly, completely alone. This isolation was not merely physical. It was informational, emotional, existential. The 25 people aboard the ship had no way to send word of their situation to anyone, no way to reach their families, no way to alert the Canadian government, no way to summon help. And perhaps more significantly, no one in the outside world had any way to reach them. The last contact with civilization had been in August, when Stephenson departed to hunt caribou. Since then, silence. The Karluk had sailed beyond the edge of the known world and vanished into the white. Families waited in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, in Alaska. They waited for letters that would never arrive, for telegraph messages that would never be sent. As the weeks turned to months, hope dimmed and worry grew. But aboard the Karluk, the crew could not know what their loved ones felt. They could only imagine and write, and hope that someday their words might find their way home. The journals and letters written during the drift survive today, preserved in archives and museums. They offer a window into the minds of people facing extraordinary uncertainty with remarkable composure. The scientists continued their observations. The meteorologist recorded temperatures and weather conditions. The magnetician took readings of the Earth's magnetic field. The work seemed almost absurd under the circumstances. What use were scientific data if the expedition never returned? But the routine provided purpose, and purpose provided sanity. Captain Bartlett wrote in his log every day, documenting the ship's position, the ice conditions, the health of the crew. His entries were practical and unemotional, the record of a professional doing his duty. But between the lines, one can sense the weight of responsibility he carried. Others wrote more personally. The crew members penned letters to wives and parents, to children and sweethearts, to friends they might never see again. They described the ice and the cold, the meals in the galley, the strange beauty of the polar night. They expressed love and longing, hope and fear. These letters were folded and saved, tucked into pockets and journals, carried like talismans. If the worst happened, perhaps someone would find them. Perhaps the words would survive even if the writers did not. The silence of the polar night amplified the isolation. For weeks on end, the sun did not rise. The world outside the ship was a vast darkness, broken only by starlight and the occasional glow of the aurora borealis. The aurora, the northern lights, appeared frequently during the drift. Great curtains of green and white light rippled across the sky, shifting and dancing in patterns that seemed almost alive. The crew would sometimes gather on deck to watch, their faces upturned, their breath freezing in the air. There was no sound to accompany the display. The lights moved in perfect silence, indifferent to the small wooden ship below. The spectacle was beautiful and terrible at once, a reminder of the vastness of the world and of how small human concerns could seem against such immensity. Inside the ship, the crew found ways to fill the silence. They read aloud from the small library, adventure novels, poetry, scientific texts. They played cards and chess. They told stories of home, of previous voyages, of dreams and plans for the future. The Inuit families contributed their own traditions. Karluk told tales of the Arctic, stories passed down through generations about the spirits of the ice and the animals of the north. His wife, Karluk, sang quietly to their daughters in the evenings, lullabies that drifted through the wooden corridors like distant music. The crew learned from the Inuit in practical ways as well. Karluk taught them how to sew and repair caribou skin clothing, how to layer garments for maximum warmth, how to protect exposed skin from frostbite. Karluk shared his knowledge of hunting and ice reading, skills that would become essential in the months ahead. There was tension at times. 25 people in close quarters for months on end, with no certainty of survival, could not avoid occasional friction. Personalities clashed, tempers flared, small grievances festered in the confined space. But the crew, for the most part, managed these tensions with restraint. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that cooperation was not merely preferable, it was necessary. Conflict could be fatal. Unity might mean survival. Captain Bartlett set the tone. He was fair and consistent, demanding discipline without harshness. He listened to concerns and addressed grievances calmly. He kept his own fears private, presenting always a face of steady confidence. The weeks passed. The isolation deepened, and the crew of the Karluk learned to live with silence, with uncertainty, with the profound loneliness of being utterly beyond the reach of the world they had known. They wrote their letters, they kept their journals, they waited, and the ice carried them on. In the quiet, they found their own thoughts, their own prayers, their own peace. You may find yours as well. Rest here a moment. There is time. As the polar night deepened and the temperatures dropped far below zero, life aboard the Karluk turned inward. The world outside became hostile, a frozen darkness where exposed skin could suffer frostbite in minutes. The world inside, though cramped and imperfect, became a refuge. The ship herself was a study in contrasts. Above deck, the rigging was coated in ice, the wood frozen solid, the metal fittings painful to touch without thick gloves. But below deck, in the galley and the mess, the crew created pockets of warmth that sustained both body and spirit. The galley stove was the heart of this interior world. It burned coal, carefully rationed, precious coal, and radiated heat into the small cooking space and the adjacent mess. The cook, Robert Templeman, kept the stove going from before dawn until after the evening meal, timing his fire to maximize warmth during the hours when the crew gathered. The meals he prepared were simple but essential. Breakfast was often porridge or oatmeal, sweetened with condensed milk when supplies allowed. The midday meal might be hardtack biscuits with canned meat or beans. Supper was the main event, stews and soups that simmered for hours, stretching the provisions as far as possible while providing warmth and nourishment. Tea was served constantly. The crew drank enormous quantities of tea, hot and strong, sweetened with sugar. The ritual of holding a warm cup, of feeling the steam rise against cold cheeks, was as important as the liquid itself. Tea was comfort. Tea was normalcy. Tea was a small pleasure that could be repeated several times each day. The mess table, a rough wooden surface worn smooth by years of use, served as the gathering place for the crew. Here they ate and talked, played cards and read, argued and reconciled. The lanterns hanging from the low ceiling cast warm amber light that softened the hard edges of their circumstances. The sleeping quarters were less comfortable. The crew's bunks were arranged in tiers along the lower decks, small wooden compartments barely large enough for a man to lie flat. Each bunk was lined with wool blankets and caribou skins, layered for insulation against the cold that seeped through the hull. Men slept in their clothes, heavy woolens, sometimes even their outer jackets. The idea of undressing for bed, of slipping into night clothes as one might at home, was absurd under these conditions. Warmth was too precious to surrender. In the mornings, the men would find their breath frozen on the blankets above their faces, delicate patterns of ice that testified to the cold. They would rise slowly, stiff and reluctant, and make their way to the galley for the first cup of tea. The routine of rising and sleeping helped structure the timeless days. With no sun to mark morning and evening, the crew maintained an artificial schedule. Breakfast at 7, the midday meal at noon, supper at 5. Watches were divided into 4-hour shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake, always monitoring the ice pressure and the condition of the ship. Work filled the hours between meals. The crew maintained the ship's interior, caulking gaps against the cold, securing equipment, keeping the living spaces as clean and orderly as circumstances allowed. The dogs needed tending. They were housed on deck and in shelters built on the ice beside the ship, and they required feeding and care. The scientists continued their observations when possible. The meteorologist kept his weather log, recording temperatures that sometimes dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The magnetician took his readings. The work seemed to matter less and less, but the habit of scientific discipline provided its own comfort. In the evenings, the crew gathered in the mess for what leisure the situation allowed. Someone would produce a harmonica or an accordion, and music would fill the small space. Folk songs, sea shanties, hymns. The men sang together, their voices blending in the lamplight, the melody drifting through the frozen ship. Reading was another common pastime. The expedition's small library included novels by Jack London and Robert Louis Stevenson, works of history and science, collections of poetry. The books passed from hand to hand, their pages softened by constant use. Card games were popular: poker, whist, cribbage. The stakes were trivial: matches, buttons, promises of future favors. But the competition was earnest. The games provided distraction, a focus for the mind that might otherwise wander toward darker thoughts. The Inuit families had their own routines. Karluk spent hours sewing, her skilled hands working needle and sinew through caribou skin. She repaired clothing, made new garments, taught the crew's members how to mend their own gear. Her daughters played nearby, content with simple toys and games. Karluk often went out onto the ice to check on hunting conditions, though during the polar night, hunting was nearly impossible. Still, he kept himself busy, preparing equipment, repairing sleds, staying ready for the time when light would return. The ship was not a comfortable home. It was cramped, cold, and filled with the constant awareness of danger. But the crew made it home nonetheless. They found routines and rituals that gave meaning to the days. They created warmth in the galley and camaraderie in the mess. They told stories and sang songs and shared what comforts they had. This was survival of a particular kind, not dramatic or heroic, but quiet and persistent. The survival of ordinary people doing ordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. The lanterns glowed. The stove radiated warmth, and the Karluk, frozen in the ice, became a small island of humanity in the vast Arctic night. The warmth of the galley lingers still, even across the years. Let it warm you too. Settle deeper, rest here a while. Among the 25 people aboard the Karluk, 4 stood apart, not because they were separate from the community, but because they possessed knowledge that the others desperately needed. Karluk and his wife, Karluk, had spent their entire lives in the Arctic. They were Inupiat, indigenous people of northern Alaska, born into a culture that had thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth for thousands of years. They knew the ice. They knew the cold. They knew the animals and the seasons, the dangers and the solutions. Their 2 daughters, Helen and Mugby, were 3 and 8 years old, respectively. They were children of the ice in the most literal sense, born into a world of snow and seal hunts, of caribou migrations and polar nights. For them, the conditions aboard the Karluk were not exotic or terrifying. They were simply life. Claude Kadiktovik was a young Inupiat man of about 19, hired as a hunter and guide for the expedition. He was quiet and capable, with the calm confidence of someone who had grown up learning to read the Arctic's moods and movements. Together, these 4 individuals would prove essential to the survival of the expedition. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, would fill gaps that Western education and technology could not address. Karluk's sewing was perhaps the most immediately valuable skill aboard the ship. In the Arctic, clothing was not merely a matter of comfort or fashion. It was a matter of survival. The wrong garment, the wrong material, the wrong construction could mean the difference between warmth and frostbite, between life and death. The expedition had brought Western clothing, wool coats, canvas parkas, leather boots. These garments were adequate for temperate conditions, even for cool weather. But the Arctic winter, with temperatures dropping to 50 degrees below zero and winds that could cut through any fabric, demanded something more. Caribou skin was the answer. The hollow hairs of the caribou provided insulation that no wool could match. Properly sewn into parkas, pants, mittens, and boots, caribou skin could keep a person warm in conditions that would freeze someone dressed in Western clothing. Karluk knew how to work this material. She had learned from her mother and grandmother, from aunts and elders, inheriting a tradition of craftsmanship that stretched back centuries. Her hands moved with practiced ease, the bone needle piercing the skin, the sinew thread drawing tight. She made parkas for the crew members who needed them most, the hunters who would go out onto the ice, the watchmen who stood exposed on deck. She repaired tears and worn seams. She taught anyone willing to learn the basics of her craft. The crew watched her work with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Here was knowledge they had not known they needed, skills they could not have acquired from any book or university. Karluk's expertise lay in different areas. He understood the ice, not as an abstraction, but as a living, moving thing with patterns and moods that could be read by those who knew how. He could look at a stretch of frozen sea and know where it was safe to walk, where it was likely to crack, where pressure ridges were forming. He knew how to hunt. Seals provided meat for food and blubber for fuel. Polar bears, though dangerous, could also be a source of sustenance if encountered. Karluk understood the habits of these animals, the times and places where they might be found, the techniques for approaching them. He built snow shelters, igloos and snow houses that could provide protection in conditions where a tent would be insufficient. The construction was an art. Blocks of wind-packed snow cut and stacked in a spiral, fitted together with precision, the gaps chinked to keep out drafts. A well-built snow house could be surprisingly warm inside, heated by body warmth and a small lamp. The crew learned from Karluk as they had learned from Karluk. They observed his techniques, asked questions, practiced under his guidance. Some became reasonably proficient. Others simply gained a deeper appreciation for the knowledge that made survival possible. Young Kadiktovik was perhaps the most active of the Inuit party. He hunted regularly, venturing out onto the ice with dogs and sled, returning with seals that supplemented the expedition's provisions. He was patient and skilled, capable of waiting motionless for hours at a breathing hole, then striking with perfect timing when a seal surfaced. His contributions were measured in pounds of meat and gallons of oil, but they were also measured in something less tangible: the confidence he inspired. When Karluk returned from a successful hunt, the mood aboard the ship lifted. Fresh food was a reminder that survival was possible, that the Arctic could sustain life as well as threaten it. The two young girls, Helen and Mugby, contributed in their own way. Their presence reminded the crew of what they were fighting for, not just their own survival, but the possibility of a future, of families and children, of life continuing beyond this frozen moment. Helen was old enough to help with small tasks, assisting her mother with sewing, playing with the sled dogs, keeping her little sister entertained. Mugby, at just 3 years old, was too young for work, but her laughter, her small voice calling through the corridors of the ship, was a kind of medicine that no pharmacy could provide. The bond between the Inuit families and the rest of the crew deepened over the months of drift. Barriers of culture and language softened. The crew saw in Karluk and Karluk not merely helpers, but teachers. They saw in Helen and Mugby the innocence and hope that made endurance meaningful. And the Inuit, for their part, found in the crew a community that respected their knowledge, welcomed their presence, and shared the burdens of survival as equals. This was not a story of one group saving another. It was a story of people learning from one another, combining their strengths, facing together a challenge that none could have survived alone. Their hands moved with patience and purpose, steady as the ice itself. Let your own hands rest now. The knowledge lives on, and the story holds you gently. 25 people from different worlds found themselves living together in a space no larger than a modest house. They came from Canada and the United States, from Scotland and Norway, from Alaska and the Arctic territories. They included scientists and sailors, hunters and doctors, men of education and men of labor. Under normal circumstances, they might never have met. Their paths would not have crossed. Their lives would have unfolded in separate spheres, each following its own trajectory. But aboard the Karluk, frozen in the Arctic ice, they became a community. Not by choice exactly, but by necessity. And in that necessity, they discovered something about the human capacity for cooperation. Captain Robert Bartlett set the tone. He was, by any measure, an exceptional leader, not because he was charismatic or inspiring in any dramatic way, but because he was steady. He made decisions calmly. He treated the crew fairly. He maintained discipline without tyranny. Bartlett understood that survival depended on order. In a crisis, chaos could be as deadly as cold. So he established routines and expectations. Everyone had duties. Everyone had a role. The ship was run with the same discipline as if it were sailing toward a destination, even though it was going nowhere at all. The division of labor was practical and clear. The sailors maintained the ship. The scientists continued their observations. The hunters went out onto the ice when conditions permitted. The cook prepared meals. The doctor monitored health. Everyone took turns on watch. These assignments were not rigid. When extra hands were needed for a task, hauling ice for fresh water, clearing snow from the deck, reinforcing a shelter, volunteers stepped forward. The work was shared because sharing it was the only way to get it done. Conflicts arose, of course. They were inevitable. 25 people in close quarters for months on end, under constant stress, with uncertain prospects. Tension was unavoidable. Small irritations grew into larger grievances. Someone's snoring disturbed a bunkmate. Someone took more than their share of a rationed item. Someone spoke carelessly, giving offense where none was intended. The usual frictions of human coexistence, amplified by the pressure cooker of confinement. Bartlett addressed these conflicts as they arose. He listened to complaints. He mediated disputes. He made decisions that were not always popular but were always consistent. His fairness built trust, and trust held the community together. The evening gatherings in the mess became essential for morale. After supper, the crew would linger around the table, the lanterns casting warm light on their faces. Someone would produce a harmonica or an accordion. Songs would begin, old folk tunes, sea shanties, hymns, popular melodies from home. The singing was not always skillful, but it was always heartfelt. Men who might have been strangers a few months earlier now knew each other's favorite songs, each other's voices, each other's ways of tapping a foot or humming along. Stories were shared as well. The scientists spoke of their research and travels. The sailors told tales of previous voyages. Karluk shared legends of the Arctic, stories of spirits and animals, of hunters and heroes. Each story was a gift, a piece of someone's life offered to the community. The cook, Robert Templeman, contributed in his own way. He found small methods to vary the monotonous diet, saving special items for celebrations, stretching ingredients in creative ways. A meal that was slightly different from the day before could lift spirits out of proportion to its actual novelty. Holidays were observed with particular care. Christmas was celebrated with songs and extra rations, with small gifts improvised from materials at hand. New Year's was marked with toasts and resolutions. These observances connected the crew to the world they had left behind, to calendars and traditions that gave shape to time. Religious services were held on Sundays for those who wished to attend. The ship's doctor, a man of faith, led simple prayers and readings. Not everyone participated, but the option was there, and for some it provided comfort that nothing else could. The community was not perfect. There were cliques and factions, preferences and prejudices. Some men were more popular than others. Some kept to themselves. But the essential bond held. When work needed doing, it was done. When help was needed, it was offered. When tension rose, it was managed before it could become destructive. This was not the stuff of adventure stories. There were no dramatic speeches, no heroic confrontations. The cooperation was quiet, daily, almost invisible. It was found in the small things. A cup of tea passed to a cold watchman, a bunk made for a sick crewmate, a word of encouragement spoken in a difficult moment. These small things accumulated. They built a foundation of trust that would prove essential in the trials ahead. When the ship finally sank, when the crew found themselves on the ice with nothing but what they had salvaged, they would need to rely on one another absolutely. The community they built during the drift made that reliance possible. They leaned on one another through the long night and found they could bear what none could bear alone. You may lean back now, too. Rest in the warmth of shared company. Survival in the Arctic was not a passive waiting. It was work, constant, physical, necessary work that filled the hours and kept the body warm and the mind occupied. Every day aboard the Karluk and on the ice around it, there were tasks to be done. These tasks were not glamorous. They would not make good stories for adventure magazines, but they were essential, and the crew performed them with steady dedication. Fresh water was a constant need. The Arctic is surrounded by frozen seawater, but seawater is salt, and salt water cannot sustain human life. Fresh water had to be obtained by melting ice, but not just any ice. Sea ice, even old sea ice, retains salt. Only ice that has weathered through multiple seasons, losing its brine over time, becomes fresh enough to drink. The crew learned to identify this older ice, the multi-year ice that appeared bluer and denser than newer formations. They would venture out onto the floes with axes and saws, cutting blocks of ice and hauling them back to the ship. The blocks were stacked near the galley stove, where they melted slowly into water barrels. This work was exhausting. Ice is heavy, and the footing on the frozen sea was treacherous. Men bundled in heavy clothing, their breath freezing on their beards, would labor for hours to collect enough ice for a day's water supply. The sled dogs required constant attention. The expedition had brought a team of Alaskan dogs, strong animals bred for Arctic conditions. They lived on the ice beside the ship, housed in shelters made of snow blocks and salvaged wood. The dogs needed feeding, frozen fish and seal meat, carefully rationed. They needed exercise or they would grow restless and begin fighting among themselves. They needed care, their paws checked for ice damage, their coats brushed free of snow. Caring for the dogs fell primarily to the hunters and to young Karluk, but others helped as needed. The dogs were essential for any future travel across the ice, and keeping them healthy was a priority. Hunting was perhaps the most critical work of all. The expedition's provisions, though substantial, would not last forever. Fresh meat, primarily seal, extended the food supply and provided nutrients that canned goods could not. Seal hunting in the Arctic is a patient art. Seals breathe air, and in winter they maintain breathing holes in the ice, small openings they keep clear by constant use. A hunter would locate one of these holes, position himself nearby and wait, sometimes for hours, until a seal surfaced to breathe. The strike had to be swift and precise. Miss, and the seal would flee, perhaps abandoning that hole entirely. Success meant meat for the crew and blubber for fuel. Karluk and Karluk were the primary hunters, but others learned the basics and assisted when possible. The work was cold and demanding, but the return, fresh food, a break from monotony, proof that the Arctic could sustain them, made it worthwhile. The ship itself required maintenance. The cold was relentless, and it found every weakness in the Karluk's aging structure. Seams opened, caulking cracked, ice formed on surfaces that needed to remain clear. The crew spent hours on repairs, filling gaps with oakum and tar, scraping ice from vital equipment, securing anything that the shifting ice might dislodge. The work was never finished. As soon as one repair was complete, another need emerged. Tools and equipment required attention. Axes needed sharpening. Ropes needed splicing. The sleds that would eventually carry the crew across the ice needed reinforcement and adjustment. Every piece of gear was examined, maintained, and kept ready for use. The scientists continued their observations when conditions allowed. The meteorologist recorded temperatures that plunged to unimaginable depths, 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, sometimes colder. He noted wind speeds and barometric pressures, building a record of the Arctic winter that would contribute to scientific knowledge. The magnetician took his readings, measuring the subtle variations in Earth's magnetic field. The work seemed almost absurd under the circumstances. What did magnetic declination matter when survival was uncertain? But the habit of observation provided structure and purpose. Watchkeeping was perhaps the most psychologically demanding work. 4-hour shifts, day and night, in the endless darkness of the polar winter. The watchman's job was to monitor the ice, to listen for the sounds of pressure building, to watch for signs of movement, to raise the alarm if the ship was threatened. Standing watch meant standing alone in the cold and dark, lantern in hand, senses straining against the silence. It meant fighting the urge to sleep, to retreat to the warmth of the galley, to ignore the faint sounds that might mean danger. The watchmen developed a rhythm. They walked circuits around the deck. They checked the lines and the hull. They listened to the ice's endless conversation, the creaks and groans, the distant grinding, the sudden cracks that might signal movement. They learned the ship's sounds so well that they could distinguish the normal from the alarming. This was the work of survival, not dramatic, not heroic, but absolutely essential. Each task, performed day after day, kept the community alive and functioning. The men who hauled ice and fed dogs, who hunted seals and stood watch, were not adventurers in any romantic sense. They were workers, doing a job under extraordinary conditions. And their work sustained them all. Their work was steady and slow, a rhythm as old as human necessity. Let your breath find that rhythm now. Rest in the knowledge of things well done. In the midst of hardship, there were moments of unexpected grace. Small things that caught the light, flickers of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. The children, Helen and Mugby, were perhaps the brightest of these small lights. They were too young to fully understand the danger of their situation, too innocent to feel the weight of worry that pressed on the adults. For them, the Karluk was simply home, the ice was simply the world, and each day was an opportunity for play. Helen, at 8 years old, was old enough to help with small tasks. She assisted her mother with sewing, handling the simpler stitches, fetching materials. She played with the sled dogs, who tolerated her attention with patient good humor. She explored the ship's corridors, finding small treasures in forgotten corners. A button, a scrap of ribbon, a piece of driftwood polished smooth by handling. Mugby, at 3, was still very much a baby. She toddled about the ship under the watchful eyes of her parents and the crew, her small voice echoing through the wooden spaces. She laughed at things only she understood. She cried when she was tired or cold, and was comforted by arms that passed her from person to person. The crew adored both girls. These hardened men, sailors and scientists, hunters and laborers, softened in the presence of children. They carved small toys from wood and bone. They made faces and funny sounds to earn a smile. They shared bits of their own rations, pressing sweets and treats into small, mittened hands. The presence of the children reminded the crew of what they were fighting for. Not just their own survival, but the continuation of life itself. The hope that these little ones might grow up, might have futures, might remember this strange time as an adventure from long ago. The animals aboard the Karluk also provided comfort and companionship. The sled dogs, a team of Alaskan huskies, were working animals first, essential for transportation across the ice. But they were also living creatures with personalities and quirks. Some dogs were friendly and eager for attention. They would press against anyone who came near, tails wagging, tongues lolling. Others were more reserved, dignified, accepting affection on their own terms. The crew knew each dog by name, knew which ones were leaders and which were followers, which were reliable and which were troublemakers. Tending the dogs was a responsibility, but it was also a pleasure. The simple act of feeding an animal, of scratching behind ears, of watching a dog curl up contentedly in the snow. These were moments of normalcy that helped anchor the crew to ordinary life. There was also a cat aboard the Karluk, a ship's cat named Shipwreck, an apt name given the circumstances. Shipwreck was a practical creature, keeping the ship free of mice and providing companionship in return for warmth and food. The cat spent most of its time in the galley, curled near the stove, or in the sleeping quarters, burrowed into blankets. It tolerated the crew's attention with feline indifference, allowing itself to be petted but never seeking affection. Yet its presence was comforting, a reminder of domestic life, of hearths and homes and the simple pleasure of a cat's company. Small comforts took on outsized importance during the drift. A cup of tea, hot and strong, sweetened with precious sugar. The warmth of the cup in cold hands. The steam rising against a frosted face. These simple pleasures, repeated several times each day, became rituals that sustained the spirit. Tobacco was another small mercy. Most of the men smoked pipes and tobacco was carefully rationed. The act of filling a pipe, of striking a match, of inhaling the fragrant smoke. This was a moment of personal pleasure, a brief escape from worry. The men would gather in the mess after meals, pipes lit, the air thick with smoke, and talk or sit in comfortable silence. The tobacco was running low by midwinter, and they knew they would eventually do without. But for now, they savored what they had. Food itself became a source of small joy. The cook's efforts to vary the diet, to create something approaching pleasure from monotonous provisions, were appreciated more than words could express. A birthday might be marked with a slightly larger portion, or a special sweet saved from the stores. Christmas brought canned plum pudding, a luxury that tasted of home and memory. These were not feasts by any standard, but they were celebrations, and they mattered. Reading materials were treasured and shared. The ship's library, small as it was, passed from hand to hand. A novel that one man finished would appear on another man's bunk the next day. Books wore soft with handling, their pages marked with countless fingerprints. Letters from home, carried aboard since departure, were read and reread. The words might be months old, the news outdated, but the handwriting was familiar, the voices of loved ones present on the page. These letters were kept close, tucked into pockets, carried like talismans. Games and music filled the evening hours. Card games were played with well-worn decks. Chess matches stretched across days. The harmonica and accordion provided melodies that filled the small space with sound and life. These were the small wonders of life aboard the Karluk. Not dramatic moments, not heroic acts, but the ordinary stuff of human existence. Children laughing, animals resting, tea steaming, music playing. In the face of vast indifference, the endless ice, the crushing cold, the absolute isolation, these small things asserted the value of being alive. They reminded the crew that they were not merely surviving, they were living. Even here in the frozen heart of nowhere, there was laughter, there was warmth. Let it settle into you now. Let it stay. The polar night descended upon the Karluk like a slow, soft curtain drawn across the world. By late November of 1913, the sun had slipped below the horizon and would not return for many weeks. The crew entered a realm of perpetual darkness, where time lost its familiar shape and the boundaries between night and day dissolved into a single, endless twilight. In this darkness, the night watches became essential. Every 4 hours, a new watchman would climb the ladder to the deck, lantern in hand, to begin his solitary rounds. The watch was not merely a formality. It was a vigil against the ice, a constant monitoring of the forces that pressed against the Karluk's wooden hull. The ice was never truly still. Even in the deep cold of the polar night, even when temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero, the frozen sea moved and shifted. Currents flowed beneath the surface. Winds pushed against the pack. Floes collided and separated, creating pressures that could crush a ship like paper. The watchman's duty was to listen, to feel, to sense the subtle changes that might signal danger. He walked the deck in slow circuits, his boots crunching on frozen planks, his breath forming clouds that drifted and vanished in the lamplight. He paused at intervals to press his hand against the hull, feeling for vibrations. He tilted his head to catch distant sounds, the grinding, the groaning, the sudden cracks that traveled through the ice like distant thunder. The lantern he carried was a small pool of warmth in the vast cold. Its amber glow illuminated only a few feet in any direction, leaving the rest of the world in shadow. Beyond the circle of light, the darkness was absolute. The ice stretched invisible in every direction, a landscape felt but not seen. On clear nights, the stars provided some comfort. The Arctic sky, unpolluted by any artificial light, displayed the heavens with extraordinary clarity. The Milky Way arched overhead like a river of light. Familiar constellations wheeled slowly across the dome of sky: Orion, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. The North Star hung almost directly overhead, a fixed point in a turning universe. The aurora borealis appeared frequently during the polar night. Great curtains of green and white light rippled across the sky, shifting and dancing in patterns that seemed almost alive. The display was utterly silent, which made it all the more strange and beautiful. Light without sound. movement without noise, a spectacle that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The watchmen would sometimes pause their rounds to gaze upward at the aurora. These moments of wonder punctuated the monotony of the watch, offering beauty in exchange for cold. The lights were a reminder that the universe held wonders beyond human understanding, beyond human concern. But the watch could not be neglected. The ice was always moving, always pressing, always threatening. A watchman who grew too absorbed in the aurora, who forgot to check the hull and listen for danger, could miss the warning signs of a pressure event. Pressure ridges formed when ice floes collided. The force of impact, driven by currents and winds, could push massive blocks of ice upward, creating walls and hills of jumbled frozen material. These ridges could rise 10 or 20 feet high, and they formed with terrifying power. When a pressure ridge began forming near the ship, the sounds were unmistakable. A deep groaning, like the earth itself in pain. A grinding, scraping roar as ice blocks the size of houses slid against one another. Sharp cracks and booms as pieces broke and shifted. The watchman who heard these sounds would ring the alarm, rousing the crew from their bunks. Men would rush on deck, assessing the situation, preparing to abandon ship if necessary. They would watch the ridge form, holding their breath, calculating distances, praying that the pressure would ease before it reached the hull. Several times during the drift, the Karluk faced such moments. The crew would gather on deck in the freezing darkness, lanterns held high, watching as the ice convulsed around them. The ship would creak and groan, her timbers straining against forces they were never designed to withstand. And then each time the pressure would ease. The grinding would slow. The ridge would stabilize. The crew would return to their bunks, hearts still racing, sleep slow to come. The psychological toll of the night watches was considerable. 4 hours alone in the Arctic darkness, responsible for the safety of 25 souls, was a burden that weighed heavily. The mind could play tricks in such conditions. Shadows seemed to move. Sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The isolation was profound. Different men handled the watches differently. Some paced constantly, their motion keeping them alert and warm. Others found still points, conserving energy, entering a kind of meditative state. Some talked to themselves or recited poetry or sang quietly under their breath. The relief of the watch change was always welcome. A new watchman would emerge from below, lantern in hand, ready to take over. There would be a brief exchange, any sounds, any concerns, any observations. And then the outgoing watchman would descend to the warmth of the galley for a cup of tea before crawling into his bunk. These rhythms of watch and rest, of vigilance and recovery, structured the endless polar night. They gave shape to time that otherwise had no markers. They reminded the crew that they were not merely passengers in their own survival, but active participants, responsible for one another's lives. The lantern that each watchman carried became a symbol, a small light against vast darkness, a human presence in an inhuman landscape. The lantern moved through the ship and across the deck, a steady glow that said, "Someone is awake. Someone is watching. We are still here." The lantern moves slowly through the dark, patient and steady. Follow its light if you wish. There is no hurry. The night holds us all. January of 1914 brought the coldest temperatures of the drift. The thermometer dropped to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The air was so cold that breath froze instantly, coating beards and scarves with delicate frost. Metal could not be touched with bare skin. It would bond to flesh and tear it away. And with the deep cold came the ice pressure. The Karluk had survived several pressure events during the autumn months. Each time the ice had groaned and shifted, threatening the hull, then eased before catastrophe struck. The crew had grown almost accustomed to these alarms, trusting that the ship would endure. But in early January, the pressure became more persistent. The sounds of grinding ice, once occasional, became nearly constant. The ship herself began to protest, her timbers creaking in new and alarming ways. Water began to seep into the hold. Captain Bartlett assessed the situation with his usual calm. He ordered the pumps manned around the clock. He had the crew begin moving essential supplies onto the ice: food, fuel, tents, sleeping bags, tools. If the ship was lost, they would need to survive on the frozen sea. The work was exhausting. Men labored in the brutal cold, hauling crates and barrels from the hold, stacking them on the ice beside the ship. The supplies piled up, a small mountain of survival materials, while the Karluk slowly settled lower in the water. By January 10th, the situation was dire. The pumps could no longer keep pace with the incoming water. The ship was listing noticeably, her deck tilting at an angle that made walking difficult. The ice pressure continued unabated, squeezing the hull from both sides. Bartlett made the decision. The ship was lost. All hands would evacuate to the ice. The final evacuation was orderly but urgent. Everything of value that could be moved was moved. Personal belongings, scientific instruments, navigational equipment, the precious stores of food and fuel. The sled dogs were already on the ice, along with the sleds that would carry supplies. The crew worked through the night, lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they made trip after trip from ship to ice. By dawn on January 11th, 1914, the Karluk was empty. Her crew stood on the frozen sea, watching their home of 5 months die. Captain Bartlett remained aboard until the very end. As the ship settled, her deck awash with frigid water, Bartlett performed one final act. He wound the ship's gramophone, a Victrola that had provided music during the long drift, and placed a record on the turntable. The music that played across the frozen sea was Chopin's funeral march. It was a gesture of defiance and dignity, a captain's farewell to his ship. The mournful notes drifted over the ice as the Karluk slipped lower, her bow rising as her stern filled with water. The crew stood silent, listening, watching, bearing witness. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Karluk disappeared beneath the ice. There was no dramatic foundering, no great upheaval. She simply slipped away, swallowed by the frozen sea that had held her for 5 months. The ice closed over the spot, and within minutes there was no sign that a ship had ever been there. The crew was alone on the ice, more than 80 miles from the nearest land. They had food, fuel, and shelter materials. They had dogs and sleds. They had each other. And they had Captain Bartlett, who stood before them in the fatting Arctic twilight and calmly began to organize their survival. The first order of business was shelter. Tents were erected, their canvas walls offering little protection against the cold. The Inuit members of the party, Karluk, and Katik, immediately began constructing snow houses, which would provide far better insulation. Fires were lit for cooking and warmth. The crew gathered in small groups, stamping their feet against the cold, processing what had just happened. Their ship was gone. Their home was gone. They were castaways on a frozen sea. But they were alive, all 25 of them. The careful evacuation had preserved not only supplies but lives. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Bartlett consulted his charts and his navigational instruments. He calculated their position and their options. The nearest land was Wrangel Island, a remote, uninhabited Russian territory approximately 80 miles to the southwest. It was their best hope, solid ground where they could establish a more permanent camp and wait for rescue. The journey would be dangerous. The ice between their current position and Wrangel Island was a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, open leads of water, and unstable surfaces. The distance was formidable, especially for a party that included 2 young children. But there was no alternative. Staying on the drifting ice was not sustainable. They had to reach land. Bartlett began planning the march. It would be conducted in stages, with advance parties breaking trail and establishing supply caches. The main group, including the women and children, would follow once the route was secured. The work of survival continued. The ice that had claimed their ship would now be their highway. The cold that had killed the Karluk would test them all. But they would move forward, step by step, mile by mile, toward the distant hope of solid ground. The ship slipped away quietly, taking with her the last traces of the familiar world. Breathe through this moment. We continue gently, step by step, into what comes next. The days immediately following the sinking of the Karluk were consumed by the urgent work of establishing a survival camp on the ice. The crew called it Shipwreck Camp, a name that acknowledged their loss while asserting their determination to endure. The camp took shape quickly. Tents were arranged in clusters, their entrances facing away from the prevailing wind. Snow walls were built around the tents, providing additional protection from the cold. The Inuit snow houses, constructed with practiced skill by Karluk and Arctic, offered the warmest shelter and became the preferred sleeping quarters for the most vulnerable members of the party. The children, the sick, those least adapted to the cold. The supplies salvaged from the Karluk were inventoried and organized. Food was the most critical concern. The expedition had been provisioned for 2 years, but much of that had been lost with the ship. What remained would need to be carefully rationed. Pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat and fat, formed the foundation of the diet. There were also hardtack biscuits, canned goods, tea, and sugar. The quantities were concerning but not immediately desperate. If hunting was successful, and if the journey to Wrangel Island could be accomplished without excessive delay, the food supply might hold. Captain Bartlett organized the party for the march. The full distance to Wrangel Island was approximately 80 miles across the frozen sea, a journey that would take weeks under the best conditions. The ice was treacherous, broken by pressure ridges that could rise 20 feet high and by open leads of black water that could appear without warning. Bartlett decided to send advance parties ahead to scout the route and establish supply caches. These smaller groups, traveling light and fast, would break trail and identify the safest paths. The main party, with the women, children, and bulk of the supplies, would follow once the route was secured. The first advance party departed on January 21st, 1914, just 10 days after the sinking. 4 men set out with sleds and dogs, carrying provisions for themselves and extra supplies to cache along the route. They would travel as far as possible, establish a depot, and return to guide the next group forward. The work was brutal. The ice was a chaos of obstacles, pressure ridges that had to be climbed or circumvented, fields of rough ice that tore at sled runners, stretches of thin ice that threatened to give way. The cold was relentless, the wind merciless. Progress was measured in miles per day, and some days the total was less than 5. Over the following weeks, multiple parties made the journey. The route was gradually established, marked by flags and supply caches. The main party began moving forward in stages, leapfrogging from camp to camp. For the women and children, the journey was particularly arduous. Karluk traveled with her 2 daughters, Helen and Mugby, wrapped in caribou furs on the sleds. The motion was exhausting, the cold penetrating. But Karluk maintained the calm that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. She comforted her children, kept them fed and warm, and trusted in the men who broke trail ahead. The march was not without tragedy. In late January, a party of 4 men attempted a crossing without authorization, hopping to reach Wrangel Island ahead of the main group. They were never seen again. The ice had claimed them, whether through a fall into open water, an encounter with a pressure ridge, or simple exposure to the cold. No one would ever know. This loss sobered the entire party. The ice was not merely an obstacle to be overcome. It was an enemy that could kill without warning. The remaining members of the expedition drew closer together, more careful, more dependent on one another. By late February, the advance parties had reached the edge of the ice near Wrangel Island. Open water separated them from the shore, a lead too wide to cross on foot. They waited, watching the ice, hopping for conditions to change. In early March, the ice shifted again, closing the lead and creating a bridge to the island. The crossing was made quickly, before conditions could change again. On March 12, 1914, the first members of the expedition stepped onto the solid ground of Wrangel Island. The main party followed over the next several days. By mid-March, most of the survivors had reached the island. They established a base camp on the northern shore, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a low ridge of rocks. Wrangel Island was not a hospitable place. It was a barren, treeless expanse of rock and ice, swept by constant winds and surrounded by frozen seas. But it was land, solid, stable, unmoving land. After months of drifting on the ice, this stability felt like salvation. The party that assembled on Wrangel Island numbered 22. 3 had been lost during the march, the 4 men who had disappeared, minus 1 who had turned back before vanishing. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, and shaken, but they were alive. Captain Bartlett took stock of the situation. They had reached land, but they were still hundreds of miles from any settlement. Wrangel Island was uninhabited. No ship would come here by chance. Rescue would require someone to go for help. Bartlett made a decision. He would make the journey himself, traveling across the frozen Chukchi Sea to Siberia, then overland to Alaska to send word and arrange a rescue. It was a journey of approximately 700 miles through some of the most remote and dangerous territory on Earth. He would take one companion, Karluk, the young Inuit hunter whose skills would be essential for survival. Together, they would attempt what seemed nearly impossible. Before departing, Bartlett organized the camp and assigned responsibilities. He left instructions for hunting, for rationing, for maintaining order. He promised to return with help, though he could make no guarantees about when that help would arrive. On March 18, 1914, Bartlett and Karluk set out across the ice, two small figures vanishing into the white distance. Behind them, the remaining survivors watched until they could see nothing more. Then they turned back to camp, to wait and to hope. Step by step, they moved forward, leaving footprints that the wind would soon erase. Let your own steps slow now. Rest is near. The island holds them, and this story holds you. Wrangel Island lay at the edge of the known world, a remote Russian territory in the Chukchi Sea where few humans had ever set foot. For the survivors of the Karluk Expedition, it became a refuge and a prison, a place of hope and hardship in equal measure. The island stretched approximately 80 miles from east to west, a barren landscape of rocky plains and low mountains, treeless and wind-scoured. In winter, it was buried under snow and surrounded by ice. In summer, the snow partially melted, revealing tundra that bloomed briefly with Arctic flowers before the cold returned. The survivors established their main camp on the northern shore, in a location that offered some protection from the prevailing winds. Tents were pitched, snow walls constructed, routines established. Life on Wrangel Island was simpler than life on the drifting ship. There was no hull to maintain, no pumps to man. But the essential challenges remained: food, warmth, and the passage of time. Hunting became the primary occupation. The island supported populations of Arctic wildlife, seals along the shores, walrus on the ice, seabirds in seasonal colonies, and occasionally polar bears. The hunters, Karluk Arctic, had departed with Bartlett, leaving Karluk as the primary provider, went out regularly, returning with game that extended the dwindling supplies. Seal was the staple. The hunters located breathing holes and waited with the patience that Arctic hunting demanded. Success meant meat for eating and blubber for fuel. The seal oil lamps that the Inuit had used for generations provided light and warmth in the snow houses, a technology perfectly adapted to the environment. Walrus was more dangerous to hunt but provided larger quantities of meat and fat. The hunters approached these animals with caution, knowing that a wounded walrus could be lethal. The successful hunts were celebrated quietly, the meat distributed among the party. Seabirds arrived as spring approached. Guillemots and murres nested on the cliffs in vast colonies, their eggs a welcome addition to the diet. The crew collected eggs carefully, mindful not to deplete the colonies entirely. Fresh eggs, after months of preserved foods, tasted like luxury. But the food supply remained precarious. The hunting was not always successful. The weather was not always suitable for hunting. The provisions salvaged from the Karluk continued to dwindle. Rationing became stricter as the weeks passed. The psychological challenges of waiting were as significant as the physical ones. The survivors knew that Bartlett had departed to seek help, but they had no way of knowing whether he had succeeded or even whether he had survived. The journey he had undertaken was extraordinarily dangerous. Many things could have gone wrong. Days stretched into weeks. Weeks stretched into months. Spring arrived, bringing longer days and slightly warmer temperatures, but no sign of rescue. The ice around the island began to break up, opening leads of dark water, transforming the frozen sea into a shifting maze. Summer brought its own challenges. The snow melted, turning the camp into a muddy, soggy mess. Mosquitoes emerged in clouds, tormenting the survivors and the remaining dogs. The tundra bloomed with small flowers, Arctic poppies, saxifrage, moss campion, a brief, fragile beauty in a harsh landscape. The survivors adapted as best they could. They moved the camp to higher, drier ground. They repaired clothing and equipment. They watched the sea for any sign of a ship. Tensions emerged as the waiting continued. 22 people confined together for months, with uncertain food supplies and no knowledge of their fate, could not avoid conflict. Arguments broke out over rationing, over duties, over decisions large and small. Some men grew despondent, withdrawing into silence. Others became irritable, prone to outbursts. The leadership fell to those who remained calm. The senior scientists tried to maintain order and morale. Karluk's quiet competence provided stability. Karluk cared for her daughters and for the camp with steady determination. But the strain was real. Some who had endured the drift aboard the Karluk, who had survived the sinking and the march across the ice, began to falter now, in the endless waiting on this barren shore. Illness took its toll. Scurvy, the disease of vitamin deficiency, appeared among those whose diet lacked fresh meat. The symptoms were unmistakable: fatigue, bleeding gums, loosening teeth, slow-healing wounds. Some suffered more severely than others. Some did not recover. During the spring and summer of 1914, while the survivors waited on Wrangel Island, 11 members of the expedition died. Some from illness, some from exposure, some from causes that were never fully determined. They were buried on the island in shallow graves dug into the frozen ground, marked by simple stones. The 11 who did not return were mourned by the 14 who remained. Each death diminished the community, reminding the survivors of their fragility, of how narrow the margin between survival and loss had become. But the 14 endured. They continued hunting. They continued rationing. They continued watching the sea. They held onto hope because hope was all they had. Somewhere across the frozen sea, Captain Bartlett was making his way toward help. They had to believe that. They had to trust that rescue was coming, even when the waiting grew unbearable. The summer sun circled the sky without setting, bathing the island in perpetual daylight. The survivors adjusted their sleep patterns as best they could, trying to rest in a world without night. They watched the horizon. They waited. And they hoped. They waited on that distant shore, measuring time in sunrises, in meals, in the small tasks that filled the hours. Let hope settle within you now as it settled within them. Rest here in the waiting. While the survivors waited on Wrangel Island, Captain Robert Bartlett was undertaking one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of Arctic exploration. Accompanied only by the young Inuit hunter Karluk, he set out to cross approximately 700 miles of frozen sea and Siberian tundra to summon rescue. The journey began on March 18, 1914. Bartlett and Karluk departed from Wrangel Island with 2 sleds, a team of dogs, and provisions for several weeks. Their destination was the Siberian coast, roughly 200 miles to the west across the frozen Chukchi Sea. The crossing was treacherous. The sea ice in this region was unstable, broken by pressure ridges and open leads. The 2 travelers navigated by compass and stars, choosing their route carefully, testing the ice constantly for dangerous thin spots. A wrong step, a sudden crack, could send them plunging into water so cold that survival would be measured in minutes. They traveled light, sleeping in hastily constructed snow shelters, eating pemmican and seal meat, pushing forward as fast as the conditions allowed. The days were growing longer as spring approached, giving them more light for travel. But the warming temperatures also meant the ice was becoming less stable. After approximately 3 weeks of travel in early April, Bartlett and Karluk reached the Siberian coast near Cape Jakin. They had successfully crossed 200 miles of frozen sea, but their journey was far from over. The Siberian coast was populated sparsely by Chukchi people, indigenous inhabitants who had lived in this harsh environment for generations. Bartlett and Karluk encountered Chukchi communities as they traveled, receiving hospitality and assistance. The Chukchi provided food, shelter, and guidance, helping the 2 travelers navigate unfamiliar territory. From the coast, Bartlett and Karluk turned south, traveling overland toward the nearest settlement with communication facilities. The Siberian interior was a vast, empty landscape of tundra and forest, dotted with occasional villages. Travel was by dog sled when snow permitted, by foot when it did not. The journey took weeks. They passed through Chukchi and Russian settlements, each time seeking directions and supplies. Bartlett, who spoke no Russian and had only limited ability to communicate with the Chukchi, relied on gestures, patience, and the universal language of human need. In late April, Bartlett reached the Russian settlement of Emma Town, a small outpost on the Siberian coast. Here, he hoped to find a telegraph station that could send word to the outside world. But the station was closed for the season, and no ships would arrive until summer. Bartlett pressed on. He traveled along the coast to East Cape, the easternmost point of Siberia, where he found a small settlement with limited communication capabilities. From there, he arranged passage across the Bering Strait to Alaska. In early May 1914, Bartlett finally reached Nome, Alaska. He had traveled nearly 700 miles since leaving Wrangel Island, across frozen seas, along Arctic coasts, through foreign territories where he did not speak the language. At Nome, Bartlett immediately contacted the authorities. He sent telegrams to the Canadian government, to the United States Revenue Cutter Service, to anyone who might be able to organize a rescue expedition. The news of the Karluk's fate, the drift, the sinking, the stranded survivors, spread quickly. The response was complicated by geography and timing. Wrangel Island was remote, surrounded by ice for most of the year. The only ships capable of reaching it were icebreakers and Arctic-capable vessels, and few of those were available on short notice. Bartlett advocated tirelessly for a rescue expedition. He met with officials, he gave interviews, he pressed every contact he had. His determination was fueled by his responsibility to the people he had left behind, the men and women and children still waiting on that distant shore. Finally, in August of 1914, a rescue vessel was secured. The King and Winge, a small schooner capable of navigating Arctic waters, was chartered to make the journey to Wrangel Island. Bartlett would accompany the expedition to guide the rescuers to the survivors. The journey to Wrangel Island was not straightforward. Ice conditions in the Chukchi Sea were unpredictable, and the King and Winge had to navigate carefully, seeking leads and open water. Several attempts to reach the island were turned back by impenetrable ice. But Bartlett refused to give up. He had made a promise to the survivors. He intended to keep it. Throughout this journey, Karluk had been an essential partner. His skills in ice travel, his knowledge of Arctic conditions, his calm competence had made the crossing possible. Without him, Bartlett might never have reached Siberia. The two men had formed a bond of trust and mutual respect that would endure for the rest of their lives. The journey from Wrangel Island to Nome, and the subsequent efforts to arrange rescue, demonstrated Bartlett's extraordinary determination. He had walked and sledged and sailed across some of the most inhospitable territory on Earth, driven by his responsibility to the people who depended on him. Now, aboard the King and Winge, he was returning to fulfill that responsibility. Whatever he found on Wrangel Island, whether survivors or only graves, he would bring closure to the long ordeal. One man carried their hope across 700 miles of ice and tundra. Rest now in that thought. Help was coming. The waiting would end. By late summer of 1914, The survivors on Wrangel Island had been waiting for nearly 6 months. The ice that had surrounded the island through winter and spring had begun to break up, opening dark channels of water between the floes. The sea, which had been their highway and their prison, was transforming before their eyes. The changes in the ice brought a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. Open water meant that ships could potentially reach the island, but it also meant that crossing to the mainland was no longer possible. The survivors were committed now to waiting, trusting that Bartlett had succeeded in summoning help. The summer brought light, endless, continuous light. The sun circled the sky without setting, hovering above the horizon in a perpetual day. The survivors adjusted their rhythms as best they could, sleeping when exhaustion demanded, working when energy allowed. The absence of darkness was disorienting, but it was also a reprieve from the long months of polar night. The tundra bloomed. Arctic flowers emerged from the thawing ground, yellow poppies, purple saxifrage, white cotton grass. The display was brief and fragile, a few weeks of color before the cold returned. But to the survivors who had seen nothing but ice and snow for so long, the flowers were a revelation. Some of the survivors walked among the blooms, touching the petals gently, reminded of gardens and meadows in distant homelands. The flowers would not save them. They were not edible, provided no practical benefit, but they nourished something essential in the human spirit. The seabirds returned in vast numbers, nesting on the cliffs and filling the air with their calls. Guillemots and murres, puffins and kittiwakes transformed the silent island into a cacophony of life. The survivors collected eggs from the accessible nests, adding protein to their diet, grateful for this abundance. Hunting continued. Karluk and the other capable hunters went out regularly, seeking seals along the shores and watching for the occasional walrus. The hunting was more successful now than it had been in winter. The animals were more active, more accessible. The food supply, though still limited, was less precarious than it had been. The health of the survivors varied. Those who had suffered from scurvy showed some improvement as fresh meat became more available. But the months of deprivation had taken a toll that could not be fully reversed. Some remained weak, moving slowly, conserving their limited strength. The children, Helen and Mugby, had survived the ordeal with remarkable resilience. Karluk had protected them through every hardship, keeping them fed and warm, maintaining their routines and their spirits. They played on the tundra in the summer light, chasing birds and examining flowers, their laughter a small miracle in that harsh landscape. The waiting grew easier in some ways, harder in others. The improved conditions, the light, the flowers, the relative abundance of food provided comfort. But the uncertainty remained. Would rescue come? Had Bartlett survived his journey? Was anyone looking for them? Rumors and hopes circulated through the camp. Someone thought they saw smoke on the horizon. Could it be a ship? Someone else reported hearing engine sounds. Was it imagination or reality? Each potential sighting raised hopes. Each disappointment deepened the anxiety. The survivors maintained their routines. They hunted, they gathered, they tended the camp. They watched the sea with patient, hopeful eyes. They marked the passing days, counting forward to an uncertain future. In early September, the weather began to change. The endless daylight gave way to shorter days, the first hint of autumn's approach. The flowers faded. The birds began to depart. Winter was coming again, and with it, the return of ice and darkness. Time was running out. If rescue did not come before the sea froze, the survivors would face another winter on Wrangel Island, a prospect that few believed they could endure. They watched the horizon more intently now. They scanned the sea for any sign of a ship. They waited and they hoped and they prayed. And then on the 7th of September 1914, a shape appeared on the water. Distant at first, then growing larger. A ship pushing through the ice floes, making its way toward the island. The survivors gathered on the shore, scarcely believing what they saw. After 6 months of waiting, after all the hardship and loss, rescue had come at last. The waiting grew lighter as summer bloomed, and lighter still as the ship appeared. Let your waiting ease as well. Breathe slowly. The story nears its gentlest turn. The ship that appeared on the horizon on September 7th, 1914, was the King and Winge, a small schooner that had been chartered to rescue the Karluk survivors. At the bow stood Captain Robert Bartlett, returning as he had promised to bring his people home. The survivors on shore could scarcely believe what they were seeing. After months of waiting, after hope had flickered and nearly died, rescue had finally arrived. They gathered at the water's edge, waving, shouting, weeping. Some fell to their knees. Others simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by emotion. The King and Winge anchored as close to shore as the ice and water depth allowed. Small boats were lowered to ferry the survivors from the island. The first to be brought aboard were the most vulnerable, the children, the sick, those weakened by the long ordeal. Helen and Mugby were lifted into the boats gently, their mother Karluk beside them. The little girls looked around with wide eyes, uncertain what to make of this new ship, these new faces. But they could sense the relief of the adults around them, and they relaxed into the safety of arms that held them close. One by one, the survivors were brought aboard. They climbed over the rail of the King and Winge and stepped onto the deck, leaving Wrangel Island behind. Blankets were wrapped around their shoulders. Hot drinks were pressed into their hands. For the first time in nearly a year, they were safe. Captain Bartlett greeted each survivor personally. He had left them 6 months earlier, promising to return with help. Now he stood on the deck of the rescue ship, watching his people come aboard, knowing that he had kept his word. But the joy of reunion was tempered by sorrow. Of the 22 people who had reached Wrangel Island, only 14 remained alive. 11 had died during the long wait, from illness, from exposure, from the accumulated toll of deprivation. Bartlett listened as the survivors told him of each loss, of the graves that marked the rocky shore. The dead would remain on Wrangel Island, buried in that remote place far from home. There was no way to bring their remains back across the sea. They would rest there forever, memorialized only by simple markers and the memories of those who had survived. The King and Winge departed from Wrangel Island on September 8th, carrying the 14 survivors toward civilization. The journey took several days, navigating through ice floes and across open water, heading for the coast of Alaska. Aboard the ship, the survivors began the long process of recovery. They ate regular meals, real food prepared in a real galley, served on plates with utensils. They slept in bunks in cabins under roofs that did not threaten to collapse. They spoke with the crew, with Bartlett, with one another, slowly processing all that had happened. The world they were returning to had changed in their absence. In August of 1914, while the survivors waited on Wrangel Island, war had broken out in Europe. The great powers of the world had mobilized armies, and the conflict that would become known as the First World War had begun. The survivors learned of this news gradually as they approached Alaska. The scale of the war, the scope of the violence, seemed almost incomprehensible. They had spent a year focused on their own survival, isolated from world events. Now they emerged to find civilization engaged in destruction on a scale they could hardly imagine. On September 13, 1914, the King and Winge arrived at Nome, Alaska. The survivors stepped off the ship onto solid ground, onto streets, into buildings, among people who had never drifted on the ice or waded on a frozen island. Telegrams were sent to families. Arrangements were made for the survivors to travel home. The Canadian government began official inquiries into the expedition and its fate. Newspapers published accounts of the ordeal, making heroes of Bartlett and the others who had endured. For the survivors, the return to ordinary life was both a relief and a challenge. After months of deprivation, the abundance of civilization seemed almost overwhelming. Warm rooms, soft beds, plentiful food. These simple things required adjustment after so long without them. Some survivors recovered quickly, resuming their lives and careers with apparent ease. Others carried the experience with them for years, haunted by memories of the ice, of the deaths, of the endless waiting. The psychological wounds healed more slowly than the physical ones. Families were reunited. Parents embraced children they had feared were lost. Spouses held one another and wept. The long uncertainty was over, and though the losses were grieved, the living were grateful simply to be alive. Captain Bartlett was honored for his courage and leadership. He had brought his crew through an impossible situation, losing far fewer than might have been expected. His journey across the ice to summon rescue was recognized as one of the great feats of Arctic endurance. But Bartlett himself remained modest about his accomplishments. He had done his duty, he said. He had kept his promise. That was all any captain could do. They were found, they were safe, they were home. Let that knowledge settle gently within you. The journey ends and rest begins. In the years that followed the rescue, the survivors of the Karluk Expedition scattered to their separate lives. Some returned to careers in science, continuing the research they had begun before the drift. Others went back to the sea, unable to imagine any other life. Still others sought quieter paths, content to live out their days far from ice and cold. Captain Robert Bartlett became one of the most celebrated Arctic explorers of his generation. He led numerous subsequent expeditions to the north, never losing his respect for the ice or his commitment to bringing his crews home safely. He lived until 1946, dying at the age of 70 in New York City, his adventures behind him but never forgotten. Bartlett wrote about his experiences, publishing accounts of the Karluk expedition that brought the story to wider audiences. His book, The Last Voyage of the Karluk, became a classic of polar literature, praised for its honesty and its vivid portrayal of survival. The Inuit families, Karluk, Helen, and Mugpi, returned to Alaska after the rescue. They resumed the life they had always known, hunting and fishing in the Arctic lands that were their home. Their contributions to the expedition's survival were acknowledged by those who understood, though they received less public recognition than the European members of the party. Helen, who had been 8 years old during the drift, grew up to have a family of her own. She carried the memories of the Karluk with her, occasionally sharing them with her children and grandchildren. The experience had shaped her in ways that were difficult to articulate. A deep appreciation for warmth, for food, for the simple security of solid ground beneath her feet. The 11 who died on Wrangel Island were memorialized in various ways. Their names appeared in official reports, in newspaper accounts, in the memories of those who had known them. Some had families who grieved their loss for decades. Others were more anonymous, their stories fading with time. The Karluk herself rested on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, approximately 400 feet below the surface, in the waters of the Chukchi Sea. Her exact location remained unknown for many years. She became a ghost ship, remembered but never seen, her wooden hull slowly claimed by the cold, dark water. The artifacts of the expedition found their way into museums and archives. Journals and letters preserved through the ordeal were donated to institutions in Canada and the United States. The words written on the ice, the observations, the fears, the hopes, became historical documents available to researchers and curious readers. The gramophone that Bartlett had played as the ship sank was lost with the vessel, but the memory of that moment, the funeral march drifting across the frozen sea as the Karluk slipped beneath the ice, became one of the most enduring images of the story. It captured something essential about human dignity in the face of loss. In the century since the expedition, scholars and writers have returned to the Karluk story many times. Books have been written, documentaries produced, articles published. Each generation finds new meaning in the tale, lessons about leadership, about resilience, about the fragile bonds that hold communities together under stress. The Arctic itself has changed since 1913. The ice that trapped the Karluk has retreated as the climate has warmed. The seas that the expedition navigated are more accessible now, crossed by ships and studied by scientists. Wrangel Island, once remote beyond imagination, can be reached by modern vessels in the summer months. But the essential truths of the Karluk story remain unchanged. The ice is still dangerous. The cold is still unforgiving. Survival still depends on preparation, on leadership, on cooperation, on the quiet virtues of patience and persistence. The survivors understood these truths in ways that could not be taught from books. They had learned them in the lantern light of the galley, in the endless watches of the polar night, in the long march across the ice. They carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. And now, across the distance of more than a century, we can still learn from their example. Not the dramatic lessons of heroism and adventure, but the quieter lessons of endurance. How to wait, how to hope, how to trust in one another when the world turns cold and dark. These are the small wonders that survive when all else is lost. Memory holds what time cannot, the lantern light, the steady hands, the patient waiting. Rest now in gentle knowing. The story lives on, and so do we. And so we reach the end of our journey together, this long and quiet voyage through the frozen north. We began in June of 1913, when a wooden brigantine named Karluk departed from Esquimalt, British Columbia, carrying 25 souls into the Arctic. We followed them through the ice, through the drift, through the polar night and the coming of dawn. We watched as the ship became trapped, as the ice carried her northwest through the Beaufort Sea, as the crew adapted to a world without control. We sat with them in the galley, shared their tea and their stories, listened to the music of harmonica and accordion drifting through the frozen air. We learned from the Inuit families, from Karluk and Karluk, from young Katik, whose knowledge of the ice made survival possible. We saw the children, Helen and Mugby, playing in the hold of a ship that was slowly dying. We stood on deck as the Karluk sank beneath the ice, the strains of Chopin's funeral march fading into silence. We followed the survivors across 80 miles of frozen sea to the barren refuge of Wrangel Island. We waited with them through the long months, through sickness and loss, through the uncertainty of not knowing whether help would ever come. And we accompanied Captain Bartlett on his extraordinary journey, 700 miles across ice and tundra to summon rescue. At last, we saw the ship appear on the horizon. We watched the survivors climb aboard the King and Winge, wrapped in blankets, weeping with relief. We followed them home to families and to a world changed by war. Of the 25 who departed Esquimalt, 14 returned. 11 rest still on Wrangel Island, in that remote place at the edge of the world. We remember their names with respect, honoring their courage and their sacrifice. This is a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, of patience and resilience, of cooperation and hope, of lantern light in the darkness, and the steady human heartbeat that endures when all else fails. Thank you for traveling with us tonight. Thank you for your patience, your stillness, your willingness to drift through time and ice to a distant century. If you would like to share where you listen to this story, your city, your country, the place where you found rest, you are warmly invited to do so. We are a community of quiet travelers, connected across distances by stories like this one. The ice has melted, the night has passed, but the story remains, held gently in memory. This is where the story rests, and so may you. Sleep well, traveler, sleep well.